So, I don't want to make a habit of this, but I feel like I should go to the bathroom. Or I didn't realize we were already recording.
Okay, I'll stop the recording.
Look, man.
Hey everybody, Will and Matt here from Downtime Activities with bonus action episode 2. Today going over character backstories.
Character backstories. Let's start.
Everybody has them.
Everybody has a story.
Needs them.
You don't know somebody until you've walked a mile in their backstory. That's all I'm saying. What is a backstory? Well, let's just start by breaking down what is a character backstory for a RPG.
Well, in like a writing sense, a backstory is just everything. You know, it's the character story up until like the story that you're reading or seeing starts, right?
Or playing
in the case of tabletop RPGs. So it's like your character backstory is just everything that your character has been through up until session 1.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of. I think a lot of people have problems with character backstories. I think the joke is always that a character either doesn't have one, or it's 15 pages about how all their like edgy pasts and deals with the devil and and all this other stuff.
I think that different people can approach backstories very differently, and because of that, it's seen as this like either somebody just doesn't care and doesn't give a rip and just like my character is this class and that's who he is, or it's somebody like you're saying, it's like the person. For instance, you as a player, you are an author. You like to write. So, and I've run campaigns before where you give me a backstory. Now, it's not the 15-page long essay edgelord.
I've come close, I think, to 15. But
you will more often than not, I'd say you'll at least have something physical to throw my way. And I don't want to say that you get more out of my campaigns because of it, but at times you definitely have, or at least your character is more tied into the world because of it.
I think that was definitely true with Throki in the Northlands campaign.
Mm-hmm.
That I think that's just not backstory. There's been a lot of sort of out of gameplay session conversations we've had and stuff that we've worked on with that character that has helped. But he was one of the ones that had a relatively solid backstory going into it. I like doing it. I really like characters that feel grounded in the world, and to me that's what backstories are. That's how characters end up grounded in the world is through backstories. It can be hard to reconcile like the DM's world and like character backstory ideas and stuff, which is why a lot of times anymore I try sort of not necessarily to come up with a character at least like fully fleshed out backstories and stuff until we know the worlds that we're working in.
Good advice a lot of the time. I mean, when it comes to backstory, there's kind of a expectation or a role, a job that the player has with the backstory and that the DM has once they receive that backstory. So, first of all, before we break that down though, backstories can be written, they can be conversations, they can be... I don't know. There's all sorts of different things. I know that we've had games before where where DMs are like, pick a song that you feel like explains your character, and you can kind of draw inspiration from that. The important thing is that whatever way you express it, that it ties your character into the world, and that it gives your character a sense of history. That this character doesn't just appear as a individual at the start of the game, but there's something kind of tying them, that they have a past, and that past sometimes can come back to help or bite them depending on what deals they've made in the past or who's out to get them. There's a lot of useful stuff there, and you as a player need to give that stuff out, come up with that stuff, give it to the DM, and then the DM needs to act on it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, I think the character secrets from your first campaign were a really good example of character backstories, or at least elements of character backstories coming up directly over the course of gameplay. Obviously, character secrets aren't the only way to do that, but it's a pretty easy way to do that. It's I feel like I struggled a little bit doing that in the campaign, the big D&D campaign that I ran. Partially because your characters, like I think especially your character and Maddie G's character, didn't necessarily need any of that. You were investing your characters in the world at every possible turn anyway, so I didn't really need to rely on the backstory stuff. But like, you guys went to visit your brother at one point, in that campaign, and even just drawing upon small things like that, really, really matter, and I think it is the DM's job to make backstories matter. Mm-hmm. That's difficult depending on the backstory that people have built. I mean, it's sort of the again, this the sort of 15-page long edgelord backstory is kind of a hard thing to draw from, at least to draw from in a way that's validating, not just to the campaign as a whole, but to the players, and not just that player.
Exactly,
but all
the players plural. Yeah. If your backstory is so dense and so full of, like, if you've written an entire other campaign and you as a player expect all that stuff to come up and be in the forefront of the story being made, run a game. That's kind of my advice to you. Or write a book. There needs to be a middle ground there. Don't be the player who doesn't care and just says that I'm just whoever. Like, make your character ingrained in the world. You'll have more fun. Everyone will have more fun because of it. And don't be the player that wants to be have the whole story be about this story they came up with. Like, make your character invested, but give other people their time to shine and for their backstories to come through.
Well, and I think going backstory light or going backstory heavy can both be fine. It's, you don't need to have everything written out, and sometimes having everything written out is kind of oppressive. I think there's sort of an ideal middle ground, but I also think that making characters that are light on backstory, or characters who don't necessarily know all their own backstory, if you trust your DM to meddle with elements of your character, that Win Hex is a very good example of that. Of like, and it's something that I like doing quite a bit, is coming up with a character concept and being like, all right, Erickson, finish this.
Yeah.
I've established this, but my character doesn't know A, B, and C.
In this case, my character is who they are, and they are cursed. And they don't know what that statistically or story
they only
means.
Know they are cursed.
They are cursed.
So I think backstory light isn't a bad thing. If you trust your DM to fill in those gaps, which is, I regularly, if a character concept like that comes to me, I'm like, it's like, oh, I'll just save this for a campaign that Erickson's running because I know, like, he'll come up with something fun for this, even if it's punishing. Like, it's going to be interesting.
And DMs love that stuff. Just so you know, if you're a player and you have an idea like that, 99% of people who run D&D games love that kind of stuff, and they love getting that freedom. And as long as you don't have a jerk running your game, you're not gonna go up to them and just be like, I have a curse, you get to decide what it is, and they're gonna be like, your curse is that you're blind and deaf and only have one leg and no arms, and like, it's not, they're not gonna be monsters about it.
I'm pretty sure I know what my curse is.
Exactly. They're going to do something that's cool, and in the case of that, for better or for worse, something that probably ties that curse or that unknown element of your character into the story. And that can have big, punchy payoffs in the story and make your character have that moment where it's like, aha, this is what was going on all along, and oh no, I'm now all a part of this because of it.
Well, and that, like, that was one of the, like, that was, I think, a really good example of, it came up, I think, 3 different times, each time in sort of a subtly different way. And every time it came up, it was so, like, I think the first time was, there was like a cleric and a paladin in the party, and one of them used Turn Undead, and I had to make a save. Which was immediately like, okay, this has something to do with the curse. Like, it was something so kind of weird.
And if I remember correctly, you made the save, so it wasn't revealed at that point what the effect would be.
Well, I think I made the save the first time, and then the second time I failed the save and took a level of exhaustion. Which is detrimental, but not truly crippling. Which I think it was, like, mechanically a very good sort of balance there, especially since it happened at, like, the end of a fight, so it didn't really matter.
It wasn't something that ruined the fight, made you guys unable to
win
or anything.
I love shenanigans characters.
There will probably be one of these talking about shenanigans characters in the future,
which will probably just mostly focus on a lot of the characters that I've made. But they are kind of an easy way to make your character's backstory very present and give the DM a lot of tools to play with. To me, that's the sort of backstory light case where it works really well. Is you don't know everything about your backstory, and it lets the DM sort of build stuff in. Backstory heavy also works very, very well. I think Hadrian Victus is a decent example of that. You built not necessarily a lot of specific examples, but you built a lot of backstory into him, which really influenced a lot of what that character was when you started playing him, what he became over the rest of the course of the campaign, and the NPCs that he knew and interacted with, and just even the sort of resources he had available to him and stuff.
That's true. And don't try and use that as like a free feat, like a power up for your character that like, my backstory is that I'm the son of the most powerful and wealthy person, so I get to start with more money or something like that.
No, what it probably means is you'll end up with a character like Stephen Starlight.
Who's a performance arts magic school major, whose dad's a military magic general, and who judges you and treats you like a Sally because you're not a military magic, you performance arts magics. It's but it's important to say that like making a character a big backstory or a like doing the backstory heavy does not necessarily mean detail specific heavy.
Right.
It's just that you have a good idea of what your character has done broadly, the kind of interaction they've had, a couple of people, family or coworkers or, like important NPCs that might be tied into that. And then like what their job or their tasks that they've been at are broadly and what that means for the start of the campaign.
Right.
Why, in that case, something weird magical's going on. My guy's a magic cop, so he's naturally would be going to go and check it out. And if your character has that history pre-built, that's like, this is what he's done for a living, so he shows up with jurisdiction to take over this situation, then it immediately ingrained him in the story.
Absolutely. And provided the driving force of the rest of the campaign. It would have been really interesting to see what that campaign had been with your sort of the original two characters before they died. I think this is the second. This is now
horse archers are a hell of a drug.
Yes, both bonus actions. We've talked about that. But it really gave the driving force and the driving impetus for that character, and because he was sort of forcefully dragging some other characters along, just of the sort of the story of the rest of the campaign. When you're making a character, where do you begin with the backstory?
It's so dependent on the character and dependent on like who's running the game and the world they're running it in. For me, a lot of it has to do with the world, and I tend to be the person who makes a character that tries to make a character that fits the world that's being built and helps drive the story along. I think it's kind of the DM in me coming out as a player, right, that like I want to do everything I can to help build that and make my character aid the DM in pushing the plot and the narrative forward. That being said, I think the starting point has a lot to do also with the character idea I have, and which is kind of a vague answer to your question. Like the character idea meaning like if my idea for a character is a artificer wizard mix that's this like magical, super knowledgeable magical person who's like, I have an idea for a personality, and then I kind of start building a backstory that would help shape that personality and that character concept.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think that if different people will do this very differently, again, there's no right way to do this, but I'm someone who I enjoy the crunch of the game and I enjoy kind of figuring out how to combine abilities and stuff like that. And I come up with that idea, and I come up with an idea of a personality for a character who would inhabit those shoes, be that kind of person. And then I'm like, hey, this guy, in the case of the character we're talking about now, like, this guy's a bit of an a-hole. Like, he's not very nice, and he's very, like, ruthless, very regimented. He's probably got some sort of background in that, maybe military. I decided in character creation, I thought it'd be cool to have a character with a downside of having like a kind of hobbled leg, that he has a bit of a gimp when he walks. And I'm like, backstory that's regimented, he has a gimp when he walks. He was in the military and he was injured in the military. Now I have that whole piece of my backstory there.
And, and then fit well with the world that I had built, because there was a pretty well-known war about 30 years ago that was recent in a lot of the memory of the characters in the world.
And it made for this character who, like, as a younger man, witnessed bad things and had an injury and had these things. He saw rough stuff, and then now this is 30 years after that war's happened, and he's a grown adult who's been doing a pretty ruthless job for years, and you can see, like, oh, that's why this guy's got no social ability at all. That's why he's so blunt and so direct and so, like, kind of heartless at times. Is like, that's been his life and his upbringing and his job. And then these things all kind of interweave together, where, like, the character concept meets the personality you want, meets the world and the setting and the things the DM has decided. And if you can kind of try and just mix that balance between all those things to where each of them makes sense in the context of your character, then you can make a character that's, like, really tied into a story.
Yeah, I tend to, if I have a good idea for a moment or sort of a backstory element, something that's kind of interesting, then sometimes I'll just sort of build a character off of that. But then a lot of times it does work in reverse, where if I have a character that I think is interesting, either sort of deciding how they became that way, or to some degree just sort of quickly bolting a backstory on, so that I can just
play the character.
Which is the worst of the ways to do it,
but not a wrong way.
No, especially if it's still got some of that detail and some of those elements to draw upon. I think a good example of the former, of having an idea for a sort of backstory element and then building a character to some degrees around that. I had the idea for a character who, I've talked a little bit about this, like, was like a thief their whole life, finally kind of went straight and was, like, very proud of it, and then wakes up one morning, like, next to the ruins of a caravan. They've been, like, brained in the head, and they have no memory of, like, they remember they went legit. They have no memory of, like, where they are, what happened to this caravan, and they've got all these other sort of gaps in their memory now. Like phrases or names that they can kind of half remember to let, and, given the DM the room to kind of play around with, like, if this character's always remembering somebody's name and remembering it's important but not why,
or what is
that gives an NPC, for the DM to draw upon in some ways, and that's kind
of
a
very open-ended NPC for them to be. They can make an NPC they already have fit that name, and all of a sudden that important NPC, you hear that name and you're like, I need to talk to this person, and that person's an important part of the DM story, and everything comes together.
You show up and they're just like, you again,
and you're like,
I have no memory. I don't remember anything.
Yeah.
You mean those, kind of example of one of those, like, having sort of a moment or having kind of elements of a backstory and then building a character around it, that I found interesting, and then it makes the character more interesting by extension. I think that's a lot of what backstories do. Is they can serve to make the characters more interesting. That's, everyone always kind of jokes about how the fighter in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is just like white bread hit with stick. Like,
I am man in armor with sword.
I get attack.
Stab.
I get another attack. What's my next class feature? Another attack.
Exactly.
But what makes fighters interesting is the type of people they are, and the backstories that they have.
It doesn't matter how mechanically interesting your character is. If you don't have an interesting backstory, you might be able to be very impressive in a round of combat when you combine these 3 niche abilities and do one big attack for 1,000,000 damage. Now it's like, wow, cool, you rolled the most dice. What's your guy's name again?
Exactly.
And you're like, oh, well, I forgot, I don't know. The backstory is what makes a character interesting.
Well, and it makes characters easier to remember. It makes them more impactful. It makes the sort of life or death element of tabletop RPGs more impactful. I think Spardauer is a good example of that. We directly saw so much of his backstory over the course of the first half of that campaign, dealing with like rescuing his wife and like him trying to find his daughter, and just this struggle against even like his own kingdom. Yeah. Like every time we interacted with him, and he's like, we need to fight back. We need to do something. The kind of
classic joke session where half of the session was just me trying to get it through Brody as a character's head to like, this isn't going to work.
I spent so long walking back and forth through that city talking to the same 3 or 4 people.
That was who the character was, and he was playing to his character.
Absolutely, and we got to see and interact with so much of his backstory, and it wasn't a particularly unique backstory, but it became very personal to our whole party. That and like to the point where it's like our characters were putting life and limb on the line quite consistently to try and help him rescue his wife or find his daughter, and
all of which was player-driven backstory that I asked him what was happening before the game started.
Absolutely.
And he came up.
He built all of that into his character, and it meant that when he eventually died.
Spoiler alert.
It was a spoiler alert for a campaign you'll never see because
it was played years ago.
Because it was the first campaign we ever did. It mattered. It mattered a lot to the party.
It was, as we can all agree, the number one tone shift of the entire campaign.
And it wouldn't have had any of that impetus if his backstory hadn't, if he hadn't had a backstory like he did, and if it hadn't been present as it was. Through the campaign.
When we were talking earlier, just something I want to brush on before it leaves my brain. To kind of flip back to a different topic here. We were talking about how when I make a character, I tend to be the person who looks at the world and has a character concept and weaves my character into the world to try and just like, I want it to be an organic shift as much as I can. And I think that that's one of the 2 very right ways to do a character.
I think I know where you're going.
And the other is the opposite direction of that, but still a very right way. And that is to be a character who you have a really strong idea and you give it to the DM and give them some ownership of it, and then if you are the DM, you make it part of your world. I think that's something that you are much better at than I am, and I think it comes from a writing background of like your characters oftentimes aren't just the character; they're a character with a story and a goal, and that can be a thing that you set out, and it does. You're good at me leaving it vague enough that it can weave into the story, and you don't. If we're doing a sci-fi campaign, you're not like, my guy has a castle or something like that. Like you make it make sense to the world. But you as a player can introduce those elements, and a good DM will tie them into their world and make them matter.
No, and then there's absolutely an argument to be made about building and running a campaign based entirely off of the characters that the players make, which is something we've sort of dabbled in a little bit in the past. We've never sort of run a full campaign quite in that style, but it's an idea I find very interesting because it builds that into the world.
Yes.
And I mean there is a balance there. You're right. You don't want your players to introduce elements that are directly at odds with the sort of rules of the world. Especially if the world that you're playing in has kind of a handful of hard and fast rules governing
low magic setting, and the player's like, I'm a wizard from Hogwarts. It's like I have a giant school of wizards where I came from, and it's like this world that doesn't fit in there. Maybe play that character in a different game, or we can try it. Or if other people want to, we can kind of shift this campaign to be one that'd be more fitting.
It's hard to be it's hard to be a musketeer duelist character in a Conan the Barbarian style campaign.
Exactly.
But there is a good DM is going to be able to work with a lot of character concepts, even if it is something that didn't quite fit. They can bend pieces of the world around it and make it fit.
And the player needs to also kind of respect that, and the other way might need to bend their story a little bit to make it fit to the confines of the world that the game's being played.
And that's where sitting down and talking to your DM is the best way to build your character's backstory.
Seriously, before gameplay starts, just being friends with the people you play with and talking about the game before it starts, and then if you're in like a less super tight-knit friend group playing a game, be the person that hangs out for 30 minutes after the session's done, talks about the session and talks about the stuff coming up, because those conversations really do tie into the story. And this is kind of a aside from backstory, but especially when talking before a campaign starts, those conversations can be your entire backstory. Like I said, they don't have to be written down.
Absolutely.
A lot of backstory is just like, you're having a conversation and the back and forth sparks an idea, and you're talking to the person running the game in a lot of those situations. Now they know, oh, you think that's cool, and I can tie that into this, and that makes sense, and they probably fed into it because they're like, oh, your character's a fighter, but he's from an Order of Knights. I just so happen to have an Order of Knights written into the backstory of my world, and you can be a part of them, or an order at odds with them, or whatever else, and it just... those conversations, that communication, and that willingness to adjust on both sides is what will make the story exceptional and the character feel like they're a part of the world.
No, well, you know, and if you have a campaign that you're going into sort of loosey-goosey, I think the Treasure Planet campaign that I'm running for some of you guys is a good example of that, where we sort of just needed a campaign to play when we weren't doing our mainstream D&D one, and really leaving it up to you guys of like what I guess because like a Savage World system will run anything.
Yeah.
So it was a conversation just about like what world do you guys want to play and what story do you want to do, and somehow it ended up coming down to this sort of pirates in space, this like Treasure Planet campaign. You wanted a big treasure to hunt and stuff like this. So then, you know, I took a lot of inspiration directly from the historical Caribbean and sort of the golden age of piracy in the Atlantic and old world and new world kind of struggles and ideals and stuff. And it was like, which was very easy to do, but like your characters directly, I mean,
the dependent hindrance, there will be a conversation about that at some point in the future too.
Just directly influenced the whole chunks of the campaign. It established quite a few of the main villains. It established a lot of relationships with like sort of your guys' crew and the world. Like the two characters you made had a huge impact on what the world became, and I think Matty G's characters really the same way in that campaign. What he decided to do with his priest.
Charlatan? Confiscate some pagan artifacts.
Charlatan's probably more accurate.
Charlatan in robes. Occasionally in robes.
Really influenced a lot of the elements of that world and who some of the main villains would be, and helped to establish some of that. And I think that's another campaign where I can definitely bring up elements of the backstory. I think you know, like Charlotte's father showing up as sort of one of the main villains, and especially now where you guys are at in the campaign, being a sort of present force. You know, is definitely an element to that.
And that's another example of the way I like to make characters, which is you broke down kind of the factions of the world. You said there was this East Empire Trading Company equivalent, and I was like, oh, so they're the bad guys. First of all, because they're always the bad guys. How can I set them at odds with the party, because that makes an exceptional story?
How can I guarantee that we are in conflict with them for the entire campaign?
And so I just was like, well, I wanted to try the dependent hindrance out, which will basic gist is it you make a second, not as powerful kind of character, and they are an active hindrance to your main character. And the way that they're an active hindrance to the whole party, because she is like a runaway who stole from her father, a high-up member of this company.
Both of your characters are an active hindrance to the rest of the party.
Some intentionally more so than others. But the important thing there is that in terms of backstory, that's another example of how I like to do backstory.
Yes.
How backstory works well for me. And that's just the DM set something out as like part of the world, and I was like, ooh, I can get that involved using my backstory.
And I like to create a piece of the world, if that makes sense. I like to be responsible for an element of the world. If I can create a faction or an order or something that exists. I think in this sort of upcoming Underdark campaign that you've got planned, that was kind of part of my idea with Candle, was to kind of like create this order of like sort of surfacer rangers that like work as guides and scouts in the Underdark, and make Candle a part of that, or sort of or at least somebody important to Candle's backstory a part of that.
He makes it canonized at that point.
Yes,
that is a thing that exists.
So then when those characters show up, it just immediately helps to ground your character in the world. When session 2 you run into one of those rangers. And
as a DM, once again here, make it matter. When they give you this stuff, use it, and then take it and don't just say that, like, for that as an example. Not that this is going to be a direct thing that happens in that campaign or anything like that, but don't just say, okay, this is a faction that exists, and then just like the one named NPC, just like make them show up at some point so that the person can go, okay, yay, my thing happened, you know? Make a random member of that organization approach them with a mission. With like, make it be like, if your player makes an organization, someone from that organization reaches out and asks for help with something, or they just say hi to them when they pass them in the street and say hi to them by name, and then all of a sudden a NPC doesn't even have to be named, doesn't even have to be a long interaction, just says hi to your character, and all of a sudden it's like all the other players are like, oh, he knows people here.
Well, and
he's part of this world. He's part of this town.
Put characters in that faction's colors in the bar fight in the tavern. Have them standing on the street corner when the characters are exploring the city. Like it's not hard to just sew. I mean, depending on the sort of faction or whatever you've built, it's not hard to sew those elements, even just as sort of set pieces into the world. Like it's and it's an easy way to make that character feel like they're a part of something. And
for those of you who listened to the first episode of this, I talked about how as a DM, when players have a base that they build up, threaten it and let them prove that they can defend it and use the creative juices they put into that to have that moment. Do the same with those kinds of factions.
Absolutely.
Whether it's threatening, if they make an order of knights and you make the castle that they operate out of under siege, that's one way. Or if it's their backstory ties them into a political intrigue with their family, make there be political intrigue. Make their family have their power threatened by another baron or duke from a neighboring place. Like, take that backstory, and when I say threaten it, I don't mean kill off everyone's parents because all D&D characters are orphans.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah.
But let the players defend the thing that they built, and then when they successfully do that, it will be this super proud moment. I mean, the best example I can think of is first campaign. Brandon's character's backstory had him he was kind of a child of the losing side of a war, and technically his family was kind of the bad guys in that war, but there was a moment where he was a part. I mean, the group slayed a dragon, but he got the killing blow on a dragon that was directly responsible for some of the like death of his family. And that moment where like this blue dragonborn with two lightning axes rides a dragon to the ground, killing it, and it's this epic thing, and he gets to stand up from that and be like, justice has been served on my backstory. That's the goal of the backstory, is to have those moments come up.
No, absolutely.
So as a DM, you need to make those happen. My laptop's running out of battery because there's a camera battery charging over there.
The big complaint that we always hear with backstories, and it's something this is a conversation you and I have had before as well, and this is an issue we've run into in some of our own games, as well as it's just something you see in a lot of media, not just tabletop RPGs, is backstories and the character that they're attached to not meshing, or in the example of tabletop RPGs, backstories and starting level not meshing very well.
If your character is the mightiest swordsman in all of the Eastern lands, then why is he a level 1 character?
Right.
Which is because he's probably not the best swordsman in all of these lands.
I think Epic 6 style campaigns help fix this a little bit.
They can.
Just because it's changing the power levels of level 1 and like level 3 and level 6. Like it makes everything sort of a little more powerful in the scale of its world.
Yeah.
But it's a very difficult thing to do when you make a character, because you want them to have an interesting backstory. You want them to have this past, to be interesting characters. You want to have a cool story as to why you lost your left eye.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to... There's a middle ground that has to be found between having a character with a cool or interesting backstory and having a backstory that doesn't... Sense. Yeah, that makes sense. It doesn't... Like, it's just so easy to make character backstories that don't fit the world and don't fit the character that they're a part of.
And that's something you just need to establish from the start as the DM player conversation is, this is the world we're running in. This is the starting level. Your character is a first level character in a full 20 scale high magic campaign. Then your character backstory needs to reflect that. And if you have a character in mind that you want to play at some point that's this renowned wizard from a far off school that he runs and is this very powerful being, wait till that campaign comes up and then play that character. Don't just make that backstory happen anyways and then have your guy show up and cast 2 spells and then be spent for the day. And
make that an NPC in a campaign that you run.
Exactly. That's another great way. Also, it's important to say, people oftentimes, and I think this feeds into this problem, people oftentimes feel like a epic backstory is a interesting backstory. And those two are very different.
Absolutely.
Just because your character, you lost an eye. The lost an eye story can be something very mundane, but an amazing story that really establishes who your character is. It doesn't have to be, it was plucked out by the demon god Uga Gugaba, and I wrestled him to the ground and choked him with my bare hands. It's like, it could be something completely ridiculous.
The character that lost his left eye, by the time he lost his left eye, he only had, I think, 1 point of strength remaining, because there was a
Shadow Jin are a hell of a drug.
Yeah.
A hell of a drug. But
sapping my strength score away.
Taking that epicness away from it, I think, honestly makes more room for creativity and, like, you have to be more creative in making that character make sense. An example you've used before is maybe your character is the mightiest swordsman on this entire swath of land, but they're a drunk tabaxi who doesn't remember that they're the mightiest swordsman in all of the land and has already sold his sword off to buy more boots. I
used to be the greatest swordsman.
And then in them leveling up isn't necessarily them gaining prowess, it's them remembering the prowess they had before.
Right. And that's, to me, sort of automatically an interesting character, because they're not taken seriously by the rest of the party. They're probably not taken seriously by the vast majority of NPCs. There may well be NPCs who are like, I remember him. Like it's like you're the legendary swordsman, right? Why don't you just kill all 6 of them? It's just like, look, kid,
I've had way too much to drink already.
I don't remember. It's like you see this? Yeah, steady as a rock. Yeah, but I fight with this hand. It's that is automatically an interesting character because it puts them in an interesting place in the world. It does give them backstory. It might be an epic backstory, but for all you know, most of the backstory that they're spouting is also probably bullshit.
Which is the other way to do that, which I was just wanting to say. There's my character is this good. He's just too drunk or forgetful or old to be as good as he once was.
Old characters are an excellent
example
of that, I think.
Or the other way is, my character is nowhere near as good as he says he is, but man, does he say he's good. Like the character who has this epic backstory, because that's the only story they share with anyone they talk to.
Well, and it gives that character interesting personal conflict, and it really affects how that character interacts with the world and the decisions that character is going to make. And then you get the interesting story over the course of the campaign as he potentially begins to rise to the legend that he always told about himself. That's interesting. That's cool. And that helps, and that makes the character, that puts the character in an interesting place in the world. And you're right, backstories don't have to be epic to be interesting. I mean, everybody likes the sort of the Luke Skywalker farm kid story, and at least as of the original trilogy, Luke does not have an interesting backstory. It turns out like he's a hell of a pilot,
and that's sort of all the true depth of his backstory is interesting, with like the history of the Skywalkers and the fact that like his character secret is that Darth Vader's his dad. Spoiler alert if you didn't know that, but 30 years late. But the epic backstory kind of exists there with him, with like the deep past that was his birth, but his actual upbringing is I bullseyed womp rats and drank blue milk. Like he's a
farm kid.
He's a farm kid. Who wants to go and see the world, and it's like
his dad might have been somebody, but at least as sort of as of at least the New Hope, he's not. He's a pilot, and that's it. Everything else is just over the whole story is just him flying by the seat of his pants, and he becomes by the end of that story, he is a rebel hero with this whole backstory, but he does not begin the story that way, which. Yeah, backstories don't have to be, epic to be interesting. I think is a very good way of putting it. I've talked before about how I want to play a character who is literally just a farmer, who's like, it's like, yeah, I've got a wife and 4 kids at home, and I've taken up adventuring because there's good money in it, and
gotta put food on the table.
yeah. So it's like, 80% of all the money, he keeps enough to like maintain or purchase his equipment and like live by, and everything else he sends home to the wife and kids because like, oh, you could, you survive raid 1 good dungeon and that's more than you'll make farming for 10 years. It's like oh, just get like, and he fully intends to just like, once I pull off a good big score, then I'll just head home and retire. like that's an interesting character with an interesting place in the world that does not have
there's nothing epic about that. There's nothing epic. There's nothing big overarching plot about that. It's just interesting and cool and grounded.
Right.
And it feels real. It feels like a real story. And yeah. So the big takeaway, players make good backstories, and that backstory should probably be either you entwining yourself into the plot of the story or you adding plot for the DM to entwine into their story. And then there needs to be that back and forth. There needs to be the conversation between players and DMs, and both people need to be flexible and make characters work in the world and make the world make sense still with the character existing inside of it.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a decent place for us to call this. Let's hear your most interesting character backstory. If you have down in the comments, if you have a cool idea for a backstory of a character, one you've used or a character that you've always wanted to play, and throw it in there. Maybe someone will get some inspiration from the bottom of this, and their next character will be the drunk tabaxi or the farmer just trying to take after the wife and the kids, But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this, found this helpful, found it interesting. If you did, leave a like said, comment, and go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities. Thank you, everybody. Dark soul, but he didn't sell drugs to people, to like kids. Roscoe sold drugs to kids.
but Van Cooper was a supplier, remember?
Oh, that's true.
That's
true.
Like, he was the one sourcing all the drugs.
Did he shoot anybody? He shot people. I don't know if he shot. How many people did I shoot?
Your and my characters were the only 2 that made it out alive from that.
And yours was like on the road, on the run from the cops, and I was like never to see the light of day in a prison cell again.
Out of 4 or 5 characters, only Van Cooper and Roscoe Maldonado made it out of that alive. I don't remember. I think, who did I shoot? Sklur's character or Costigan's character? We were directly responsible. We got
somebody
Sklur's
OD'd,
character.
didn't they?
Yeah, didn't we? Did we get Sklur's character to kill Costigan's character? And then we killed Sklur's character?
I think that's what... I think because, like, Koskine's character had, like, the money or something like that. And, like, there's some sort of thing that we were seeking. And Sklur killed him for that, and then we killed him.
I think we got Sklur's character to kill Costigan's character because Sklur's niece had OD'd.
And
we were like, oh, it was this guy's fault.
So I didn't sell it to her.
Right. So we got... So, yeah.
We were not the good guys, but it was a really good fiasco game.
It was an excellent fiasco game. It was probably the grittiest one we did,
which is surprising for the setting, but
yeah,
true. I think so.
It was
a very grungy one.
It took itself very seriously. It didn't have a lot of apart from the whole. Like, Sklur's character being kind of goofy and the Roscoe Maldonado
party guy
thing, like, it took itself so seriously, and, like, it didn't have a lot of the humor that, like, the very first fiasco game we did.